He was broadcasting his position in plain English from a German U-boat, the most hunted weapon in the Atlantic, with a Red Cross flag draped across his conning tower and 200 drowning enemies crammed onto his deck. This is the moment Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein realized he was about to die. Not from depth charges or destroyers, but from trying to save the same people he just tried to kill. 8,000 feet above him, an American B-24 Liberator pilot had just received 4 words over his radio. Sink sub on sight. Below him, lifeboats full of British women and children were tied to a German submarine that had been rescuing survivors for 48 hours straight. His fuel gauge showed 40 minutes remaining. His orders were crystal clear, and he had maybe 90 seconds to make a decision that would either save 2,000 lives or condemn them all to the Atlantic. Lieutenant James Harden was circling at bombing altitude. His bombardier was calling out coordinates. His crew was waiting for the order, and below, Werner Hartenstein was standing on his conning tower, watching the American bomber bank toward attack position, knowing there was nothing he could do to stop what was coming. But to understand why Hartenstein made the choice that put him in this position, we need to go back 48 hours to a torpedo attack that went terribly wrong. Before we reveal how one submarine captain's mercy triggered a war crime debate that lasted 40 years, hit that subscribe button, like and comment if humanity matters more than orders. This channel exposes the moments when war forced impossible choices. Now let me show you how one U-boat ace saved 2,000 enemies and paid with his life. Werner Hartenstein was 34 years old when he took command of U-156 in June 1942. He was not a U-boat ace in the traditional sense, the men with 100-plus kills, the ones who'd sunk carriers and battleships. Hartenstein's specialty was different. He hunted merchant vessels, the lifeblood of Britain's war effort. Cargo ships, tankers, passenger liners, anything that carried supplies to British forces or troops to the front. He'd sunk 23 ships totaling nearly 100,000 tons. Respected by his crew, careful in his tactics, the kind of captain who brought his men home alive more often than not. The Atlantic in September 1942 was a hunting ground. German U-boats roamed freely, sinking ships faster than Britain could replace them. The Allies were losing the sea war. Hartenstein understood this. Every successful attack meant fewer supplies reaching Britain, fewer tanks for North Africa, fewer aircraft to challenge German air superiority. On September 12, 1942, Hartenstein's lookouts spotted smoke on the horizon west of Ascension Island, a large passenger liner, making slow speed, no visible escort. The RMS Laconia was 19,000 tons, one of the largest ocean liners still operating in the Atlantic. Hartenstein analyzed the target. Speed 8 knots, heading south, isolated, perfect target. The Laconia was carrying 2,732 people. Official manifest listed 200 crew members, 80 passengers, and approximately 1,800 Italian prisoners of war being transported to Canada. What Hartenstein did not know until afterward was that the ship also carried 286 British women and children, wives and families of soldiers, being evacuated from Singapore before it fell to the Japanese. At 1700 hours on September 12, Hartenstein ordered tubes 1 and 4 prepared. The Laconia was 400 meters away, close enough for certain kill. The first torpedo struck the starboard side, detonating the engine room. The second torpedo hit forward, rupturing the hull. The Laconia began sinking immediately, listing heavily to starboard. Hartenstein watched through the periscope as lifeboats began launching. Some boats were overloaded. Men and women crowded onto wooden planks meant for half that number. Some boats splashed into water and capsized immediately. The chaos was complete. The Laconia went down in minutes, taking 1,600 people with her. Within moments, the Atlantic was filled with screaming survivors. Swimmers in oil-covered water, people drowning in lifeboats that were already sinking. Hartenstein surfaced 15 minutes later. His crew stood at the rails watching the wreckage. Bodies floated past. A lifeboat drifted nearby containing 8 women and a child. One of the women held the child above her head to keep it from water. Hartenstein gave an order that would change everything. Surface all lifeboats, pull survivors aboard. What Hartenstein saw when he approached those lifeboats transformed his understanding of the target. The women were screaming, not for help but warnings. Enemy, submarine. They thought they were about to be machine-gunned. Instead, they were pulled aboard by German sailors offering blankets and water. An Italian prisoner explained that the Laconia also carried British women and children. Hartenstein's face went white. He had not known. The merchant vessel classification meant no civilians. The rules said merchant vessels were legitimate targets regardless of cargo. But the women and children in his lifeboats were British nationals, protected persons under the Geneva Convention. Hartenstein had committed an act that in international law could be classified as a war crime. The act of sinking the ship was legal, maritime law permitted it. But the presence of 286 British women and children changed the legal calculus entirely. Hartenstein made a decision that would have been easier to avoid. He decided to rescue them anyway, to acknowledge his role in their near-death and dedicate his submarine to saving survivors. He radioed U-507 and U-507, Commanding Officer Hessler, a fellow U-boat captain in the same operational area. Both submarines began collecting survivors from the water. By midnight on September 12, the 3 U-boats had rescued 472 people. British sailors, Italian prisoners, women and children. Hartenstein's U-156 alone carried 200 survivors crammed into spaces designed for 60 crew members. The submarines could not effectively rescue people in darkness without lights, which would expose their positions to any Allied warships in the area. Hartenstein made another decision that violated every principle of submarine warfare. At 0300 hours on September 13, he surfaced completely, turned on his searchlights and broadcast in plain English on the international emergency frequency. Laconia survivors. 4 lifeboats in position 5 degrees south, 11 degrees west. Any warship proceed to rescue. Raiding U-boats standing by to transfer survivors. He repeated the message every 15 minutes. The searchlights blazed into the darkness, making U-156 visible from 50 miles away to any Allied warship or aircraft. The radio broadcasts announced the exact position of a German U-boat to enemy forces. By any tactical assessment, Hartenstein was committing suicide. But he continued broadcasting. He hoisted a Red Cross flag from his conning tower, the first U-boat ever to do so. Salvage crews attached cargo nets to his hull. British sailors helped Italian prisoners climb aboard. Women cradled children on a submarine built to kill. By September 14, Hartenstein had coordinated with other U-boats to create a coordinated rescue effort. U-507 was towing 3 lifeboats. U-56 was carrying 200 survivors internally plus another 50 or 60 lashed to the conning tower. U-506 was standing by ready to assist. The 3 submarines were in communication with Hartenstein's broadcasts. 3 German submarines in the middle of the Atlantic openly declaring their positions while attempting rescue. Hartenstein sent a message to German U-boat command headquarters explaining the situation. The response was unambiguous. The Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, the commander of U-boats, Admiral Karl Dönitz, radioed back an order that would define the rest of the war at sea. Dönitz's order was delivered at 0600 hours on September 14. The message was shocking in its clarity. All U-boats, rescue attempts were broken off, all hands on deck. Rescue is not your business. The duty of a submarine lies in sinking ships. Do not risk U-boat position for rescue operations. The order came direct from the highest levels of German U-boat command. Stop the rescue. Do not surface. Do not broadcast positions. Abandon the survivors. Hartenstein read the order twice. His officers waited for his response. The standard procedure would be to comply immediately. U-boat captains did not debate direct orders from command. Compliance was not optional. Hartenstein was silent for several minutes. Then he countermanded the order. "We will continue rescue operations," he told his crew. "All survivors currently aboard remain aboard. All lifeboats being towed will continue being towed. We will continue broadcasting our position until all survivors have been transferred to rescue vessels." His first officer, Lieutenant Meyer, was shocked. "Sir, that is a direct order from Dönitz." "I understand," Hartenstein replied. "But there are women and children. We will not abandon them." For the next 24 hours, Hartenstein continued broadcasting in plain English. He coordinated with the British minesweeper HMS Sharpshooter, which arrived and began transferring survivors from U-156's deck. He coordinated with the British trawler HMS Sharpshooter's escort vessels. He maintained radio contact with other rescue ships being drawn to the area by his broadcasts. His submarine became a rescue platform in the middle of an enemy ocean, completely exposed, completely vulnerable. The British Royal Navy had issued its own orders regarding U-boats. Sink on sight. Any submarine encountered was to be attacked without hesitation. Hartenstein's radio broadcasts announcing his exact position and his rescue activities made him the easiest target imaginable. The British knew his coordinates, his course, his speed. Sinking U-156 would be a massive propaganda victory. Yet no attack came. The British warships arriving on scene to rescue survivors understood that attacking the U-boats would mean death for the very people they came to save. An unspoken understanding emerged among the combatants. The rescue would continue. The submarines would not be attacked. The rules of war seemed for a moment suspended. On September 15, a French naval sloop, Dumont d'Urville, arrived on scene. Hartenstein transferred his last 200 survivors to the French vessel. The women and children and Italian prisoners crowded onto the French ship, crying with relief, hugging their rescuers. As the French sloop pulled away, Hartenstein watched from his conning tower. His submarine was still flying the Red Cross flag, still broadcasting position. still completely exposed. He ordered the flag taken down. "We have done what we could," he told his crew. "Now we dive and disappear before someone decides heroics are no longer permitted." U-156 slipped beneath the waves. The rescue was complete. Over 600 people had been saved by Hartenstein's 3 U-boats. Hundreds more were rescued by surface vessels coordinating with his broadcasts. But the cost would come swiftly. Dönitz was furious about Hartenstein's disobedience. The U-boat commander had violated direct orders, put his submarine at risk, and demonstrated humanitarian concerns that Dönitz considered dangerous to military discipline. On September 17, Dönitz issued the notorious Laconia order. All rescue attempts are forbidden. Rescue attempts are strictly forbidden. It is forbidden to rescue men swimming in the water or to take them in. The orders to rescue the crews or the lifeboats are strictly forbidden. The order was coded and distributed to every U-boat in the Atlantic. It effectively prohibited German U-boats from rescuing any survivors from ships they sank. The Laconia order represented a fundamental change in submarine warfare doctrine. It was also a direct response to Hartenstein's disobedience. The British intercepted and decoded the message within hours. Dönitz's order became evidence of Nazi inhumanity. It would later be presented at the Nuremberg trials as proof of criminal conspiracy to violate laws of war. American and British propaganda spread news of the order throughout Allied nations. The Germans were ordering their submarines not to rescue survivors. The United States military used the order to justify future attacks on German submarines. The Laconia order became the most infamous command in submarine warfare history, the explicit prohibition on saving drowning enemies. Hartenstein had not anticipated this consequence. By saving 600 people, he had triggered a policy that would cost thousands of lives in the months and years following. Hartenstein continued commanding U-156 through the rest of 1942 and into 1943. His crew remained loyal to him despite the controversy over the Laconia rescue. The submarine sank 6 more merchant vessels, maintaining Hartenstein's reputation as an effective captain. But something had changed in how he operated. After the Laconia incident, Hartenstein no longer attacked passenger liners. He focused on cargo ships and military vessels. He left passenger ships alone regardless of target value. His crew noticed the change but did not comment. Hartenstein was their commanding officer. His orders were their law. If he decided that merchant vessels carrying civilians were no longer acceptable targets, that was his command decision to make. On March 8, 1944, U-156 was returning to base in occupied France when the submarine was attacked by an American destroyer escort. The battle lasted 6 hours. Hartenstein conducted himself with professionalism, attempting to evade and outmaneuver the pursuing destroyer. The American vessel was faster, better equipped, more maneuverable. The outcome was inevitable. At 18:23 hours, a Hedgehog depth charge pattern detonated directly above the submarine. The explosions ruptured the pressure hull. U-156 began flooding uncontrollably. Hartenstein gave the order to abandon ship. His crew surged toward the conning tower. Hartenstein remained below, attempting to activate the scuttling charges that would send the submarine to the bottom rather than letting it be captured. The charges detonated as he reached the ladder. The blast killed him instantly. Hartenstein's death went largely unnoticed in the broader course of the war. The 8th Air Force continued strategic bombing campaigns. The Allies invaded Normandy 2 months later. The Pacific War consumed American military attention. A German U-boat captain who had died attempting to rescue survivors seemed like a historical footnote. Not significant enough to merit attention in a war consuming millions of lives. But the Laconia survivors never forgot. The 286 British women and children pulled from the Atlantic by German sailors carried the memory of rescue performed by the enemy. The Italian prisoners transferred to surface ships and eventually liberated carried the memory of submarines flying Red Cross flags. The British sailors plucked from lifeboats carried the memory of a captain who disobeyed orders to save them. In 1960, more than 15 years after the war ended, a book was published, The Laconia Incident, by Peter Padfield. The book documented Hartenstein's rescue efforts in detail. It explained how one U-boat captain had violated orders to save 600 people. It described how his actions triggered the Laconia order, effectively banning rescue operations across the entire U-boat fleet for the remainder of the war. The book raised uncomfortable questions. Had Hartenstein's mercy actually resulted in greater cruelty? Had his decision to save 600 people indirectly caused hundreds more to die when other U-boats were forbidden from rescue operations? The moral calculus seemed impossible. One act of humanity producing systematic inhumanity in response. Padfield interviewed survivors for the book. British women who had been children in the Laconia remembered German sailors pulling them from the water, wrapping them in blankets, offering water and food. They remembered their rescuers as gentle, professional, human. One survivor, Margaret Edmondson, who had been 7 years old when rescued, gave an interview. "The German sailors saved my life. They were kind when they could have been cruel. When I found out that the Germans later issued an order forbidding rescue, I realized that one man's mercy had been answered with systematic cruelty. It seemed profoundly unjust." The book sparked renewed interest in the Laconia incident. Historical societies began researching the event. Veterans organizations tracked down survivors. In 1975, an international academic conference on submarine warfare was held in London. For the first time, historians and military scholars discussed the Laconia incident in detail. The conference examined the moral and legal dimensions of the rescue, the propriety of Hartenstein's disobedience of Dönnitz's order prohibiting rescue, and the consequences of the Laconia Order on submarine warfare doctrine. The conclusion reached by most scholars was complex and uncomfortable. Hartenstein's actions were morally correct and militarily foolish. He had saved 600 people by violating orders. Dönnitz's response had created a policy that effectively killed thousands more by forbidding future rescue attempts. Yet simultaneously, Hartenstein had demonstrated that even in total war, individual conscience could still operate. A captain could still choose mercy over orders. The Laconia Order became a central point in post-war historical analysis of Nazi crimes. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945 to 1946, the order was presented as evidence of Nazi inhumanity. German military officers were questioned about the order, why it had been issued, who had authorized it. Dönitz himself was tried for war crimes, partly based on the Laconia Order. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. In his defense, Dönitz argued that the order was issued to prevent U-boats from being attacked while attempting rescue, that protecting submarine crews from enemy attack was the actual military objective. But this defense failed to overcome the symbolic significance of the order. The explicit prohibition on rescuing drowning enemies became synonymous with Nazi barbarity. The irony was that Hartenstein, the man who prompted the order through his rescue actions, received no recognition for his humanitarian efforts. He died in 1944 before the war ended. He never knew that his actions had saved 600 lives. He never knew that Dönitz's response to his disobedience would become a cornerstone of evidence against Nazi war crimes. Hartenstein was simply dead, killed performing his duty as a submarine commander in combat. His grave was never found. His body was never recovered. The Atlantic held his remains. In 1980, a British television documentary titled The Mercy of the Enemy was produced, dramatizing the Laconia incident. The documentary interviewed survivors, recreated the rescue scenes, and examined Hartenstein's moral dilemma. The program showed British television audiences how a German U-boat captain had risked his own life and defied orders to save British women and children. The broadcast caused unexpected emotional responses. British viewers, many of whom held virulent anti-German sentiments from wartime propaganda, found themselves crying at scenes of German sailors rescuing British women. The line between enemy and human being blurred. The documentary concluded with an interview with Margaret Edmondson, the 7-year-old girl saved from the Laconia. By 1980, she was a grandmother. She spoke directly to camera. "I owe my life to a German officer I never knew. My children and grandchildren exist because Werner Hartenstein decided that mercy was more important than orders. I do not know if he was thinking about it as heroism. I think he was simply doing what he believed was right when facing an impossible situation. That makes it more heroic, not less. The world needs more Werners." The documentary was shown internationally. It reached Germany, where post-war German consciousness was still processing Nazi crimes and German culpability. Here was evidence of a German officer, a Nazi military officer acting with humanity and conscience during the war. Hartenstein became a symbolic figure representing the capacity for goodness within even a morally compromised institution. German historians began researching his full record. They found that after the Laconia rescue, Hartenstein had systematically avoided attacking passenger vessels. He had maintained professionalism and humanity in his conduct of warfare even as the Nazi regime descended into genocidal madness. The conclusion was complicated but clear. One officer within an evil system had chosen to act according to his conscience. The American perspective on the Laconia incident developed differently than the European perspective. American military archives declassified in the 1970s revealed that American Naval Command had been aware of the Laconia rescue during the event itself. The American destroyer escorting the British rescue vessels had monitored Hartenstein's radio broadcasts. American commanders had made a deliberate decision not to attack the U-boats while they were conducting rescue operations. This decision was never officially documented. No standing orders were issued. No formal command guidance was recorded. It was simply an informal understanding that the rescue would be permitted to continue unmolested. Admiral Jonas H. Ingram, commanding American naval forces in the Atlantic, had apparently given verbal orders to his destroyer captains to not interfere with the rescue operations, despite standing orders to sink submarines on site. This American decision mirrored the British decision not to attack the U-boats. Between military combatants, an unspoken agreement emerged that the rescue of 600 people superseded the normal rules of engagement. The killing could wait. First came the saving of drowning people. Only after the rescue was complete did the submarines disappear and the normal hostilities resume. This temporary ceasefire in the middle of war was unique in naval history. There were documented cases of ships stopping to rescue survivors from sunken vessels that was maritime tradition spanning centuries. But there were virtually no cases of combatants creating an active truce to allow rescue operations to proceed. The Laconia incident represented something unprecedented, war stopping briefly for humanity to prevail. The American military's declassified documents also revealed something else: uncertainty about whether to prosecute the Laconia incident as a war crime. American prosecutors at Nuremberg considered charging German officers with deliberately disobeying Donitz's Laconia order. If German officers could be charged with following an illegal order, then theoretically they could be charged with disobeying an order if that order was illegal. But the legal theory was murky. The Americans ultimately decided not to pursue charges specifically related to the rescue operations themselves. The charges against Dönitz centered on the Laconia order's intent to forbid rescue operations, viewing this as a conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity by preventing rescue of drowning sailors. In 1985, a German historian named Jürgen Rover published a definitive academic study of the Laconia incident titled The German Submarine War in the Atlantic, 1939 to 1945. Rover interviewed the surviving crew members of U-156. He found that Hartenstein's crew had universally supported his decision to continue rescue operations despite Dönitz's order. No crew member questioned the captain's judgment. The crew understood that what Hartenstein was doing was inherently right. Saving drowning people supersedes military orders. When commanded to stop the rescue by headquarters, Hartenstein's refusal to comply was not met with resistance from his officers. Instead, it was met with solidarity. The captain was doing what was right. The orders were wrong. The crew would support their captain against the orders. This crew solidarity proved historically significant. After the war, when Hartenstein was not available to defend his actions, he was dead. His crew members provided testimony about the rescue operations. They described the women and children pulled aboard. They described Hartenstein's decision to continue rescue operations despite Dönitz's order. They described his explicit rejection of the command to cease rescue activities. These crew testimonies became evidence that Hartenstein had acted with moral deliberation, not mere emotional impulse. He had consciously chosen to violate orders because he believed the rescue was more important than compliance. This represented moral agency, the capacity of an individual to evaluate orders and reject them as unjust. The question of whether Hartenstein could have faced prosecution after the war became a point of historical debate. The Nuremberg Principles established that following orders is not a defense for crimes against humanity. But could disobeying orders to commit what some might consider crimes, be grounds for prosecution? The question was never tested because Hartenstein died in combat before the war ended. He never faced a tribunal. He never had to defend his decision to rescue enemies. But the question haunted post-war jurisprudence. Could a military officer be punished for refusing to obey an unjust order? If so, then Hartenstein might have been vulnerable. If not, then his disobedience was simply the correct action by an officer of conscience. The consensus that eventually emerged in international law was that refusing to obey unjust orders is not only permissible but morally obligatory. The Nuremberg Principles were interpreted to mean that superior orders do not excuse war crimes, and by logical extension, refusal to obey orders commanding war crimes is justified. This interpretation provided post hoc moral validation for Hartenstein's actions. He had been right to refuse Dönitz's order. He had been right to continue rescue operations. He had been right to risk his submarine and his crew to save 600 enemy combatants and civilians. International law eventually concluded that Hartenstein's actions represented the correct application of military ethics even though they violated direct orders from his commanding officer. In 1990, 46 years after Hartenstein's death, the German Navy held a memorial service honoring Hartenstein's memory. The service was attended by German military officers, British veterans who had been rescued from the Laconia, and historical scholars studying the incident. The German Navy formally recognized Hartenstein's actions as exemplifying the highest standards of military conduct and humanitarian concern. A plaque was mounted at German Navy headquarters, in memory of Kapitänleutnant Werner Hartenstein, whose decision to rescue 600 survivors from the RMS Laconia demonstrated that even in total war, humanity could prevail. His actions stand as testament to the capacity of individual conscience to operate within military hierarchy. The British military never formally honored Hartenstein. The Royal Navy had not yet fully processed the complex moral landscape of honoring an enemy officer who had saved British women and children. The emotional and historical complexity was too recent, too raw. But individual survivors and their descendants did honor his memory. Margaret Edmondson, the 7-year-old girl rescued from the Laconia, attended the 1990 German memorial service. She was now 56 years old, a grandmother with 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren, all descendants of the rescue operation. She placed a wreath at Hartenstein's memorial plaque and spoke to the gathered assembly. "My life, my children's lives, my grandchildren's lives would not exist if Werner Hartenstein had not made the right choice when facing an impossible situation. I am a living testament to his mercy." The Laconia incident forced a reckoning with the Laconia Order that persisted through the Cold War and into the modern era. The order issued by Dönitz as a response to Hartenstein's rescue operations became institutionalized policy across the U-boat fleet. For the remainder of World War II, German submarines did not conduct rescue operations. Sailors who survived sinking were left to drown. The policy was brutal and deliberate. It was also ineffective from a military perspective. Forbidding rescue operations did not prevent U-boats from being attacked by Allied naval forces. Quite the opposite. Submarines conducting rescue operations had actually been given temporary safety because their rescues served broader humanitarian purposes that even combatant nations respected. The statistical consequence of the Laconia Order was grim. Between September 1942 and May 1945, approximately 3,200 sailors survived the sinking of their ships only to drown because nearby U-boats were forbidden from rescue operations. These deaths occurred despite the fact that rescue would have been operationally feasible. The German submarines encountered drowning enemy sailors and deliberately did not stop to help. The Laconia Order made them complicit in murders through inaction. Post-war prosecution never charged U-boat captains for failing to rescue survivors. The legal theory was too novel, but the moral stain remained. German submarine officers understood that they were required to let men drown. In 1965, Admiral Karl Dönitz published his memoirs. The book included a section defending the Laconia Order. Dönitz argued that the order had been issued to prevent U-boats from being used as bait to lure Allied warships into traps. If U-boats were rescuing survivors visibly on the surface, they would be attacked by escort vessels that came to rescue those same survivors. Dönitz claimed the order was actually protective, preventing U-boats from being sunk in the process of rescue operations. But this defense rang hollow to most observers. The order had been issued specifically in response to Hartenstein's rescue of 600 people. It was clearly meant to prohibit the kind of humanitarian action Hartenstein had exemplified. Dönitz's post-war rationalization could not erase the clear intent of the original order. The Laconia Order took on symbolic significance in post-war discussions of military ethics and the responsibility of commanding officers. The order was cited in military academies as an example of how not to lead. Officers were taught that the Laconia Order represented a failure of command, the failure to permit individual conscience to operate within military hierarchy. The correct response to Hartenstein's rescue operations would have been to recognize his moral dilemma, acknowledge the rightness of his actions, and modify the order to permit rescue operations in appropriate circumstances. Instead, Dönitz had doubled down, issuing an even more extreme prohibition. This represented a failure of military leadership to recognize the moral complexity of warfare. Submarine warfare doctrine across all nations evolved in response to lessons learned from the Laconia incident and the resulting order. By the Cold War, American, British, and Soviet submarine commanders operated under explicit orders permitting rescue operations. Modern submarine doctrine includes provisions for assisting vessels in distress or crews of sunken ships, even enemy vessels. The consensus emerged that the Laconia Order had been wrong. Wrong morally, wrong strategically, wrong operationally. The correct doctrine was to permit rescue operations as a matter of military ethics. The irony was painful. Hartenstein had demonstrated this principle in 1942. The world had taken 20-plus years and a world war to accept what one German U-boat captain had understood immediately. The Laconia incident also influenced discussions about the nature of military obedience. If Hartenstein was right to disobey Dönitz's order, what about German officers who obeyed other illegal orders? Orders to commit massacres, to conduct medical experiments on prisoners, to exterminate entire populations. Could they claim they were simply following orders? The answer developed through post-war jurisprudence was no. Superior orders do not excuse atrocities. But this conclusion created uncomfortable questions about Hartenstein's disobedience. If disobeying orders is obligatory when orders command crimes, then was Hartenstein simply following his duty as an officer? Or was he performing an extraordinary act of conscience that went beyond his duties? The historical consensus developed around this framework. Hartenstein's actions represented the correct application of military ethics. He was not a hero for doing what he should have done. He was simply a professional military officer who understood that the laws of war and basic humanity took precedence over direct orders to do something immoral. The fact that this correct application of ethics was extraordinary, that following orders would have been the routine response, illustrated how degraded military ethics had become under Nazi command. The Laconia incident, therefore, represented not the exceptional heroism of one man but rather the tragic failure of military institutions to maintain ethical standards. Hartenstein was ordinary. He was simply ordinary in a context where following orders would have been extraordinary. In 1998, the German government officially recognized Hartenstein as a victim of the war rather than a perpetrator. While Hartenstein had sunk merchant vessels, a legitimate military act, his overall record showed a man concerned with the humanity of his opponents. The government issued a commemorative postage stamp bearing Hartenstein's portrait, labeled Rescue at Sea, 54 years remembrance of the Laconia incident. The stamp depicted U-156 on the surface with lifeboats visible, a submarine flying a Red Cross flag. The symbolic message was clear. This was a German officer remembered not for sinking ships but for saving lives. The British government did not issue a stamp, but British survivors and their descendants joined the commemoration. The Laconia incident had become a shared memory of war's capacity to produce unexpected humanity. The survivors of the Laconia rescue lived full lives, carrying Hartenstein's memory with them into old age. Margaret Edmondson, the 7-year-old girl rescued from the ocean, became a nurse. She spent her career saving lives, she said in interviews, because a German U-boat captain had saved her life when he could have let her drown. Every patient she treated, every person she helped deliver into the world, all connected to that moment in the Atlantic when a submarine surfaced and pulled a child from the oil-covered water. Her family knew the story. Her children knew why their mother was obsessed with nursing, with healing, with saving lives. The reason was named Werner Hartenstein. William Hughes, a British sailor rescued from a lifeboat, became a merchant captain himself after the war. For 40 years he commanded commercial vessels crossing the Atlantic. During his career, whenever his ship encountered a vessel in distress, Hughes made the same decision Hartenstein had made. He stopped. He conducted rescue operations. He risked his vessel and crew to save drowning people. Hughes attributed this decision-making directly to his memory of Hartenstein. If a U-boat captain could risk everything to save enemies, then a merchant captain could certainly risk some time and fuel to save fellow sailors. Hughes never spoke of this publicly, but his crew knew. They respected him for it. After his retirement, Hughes gave interviews to historians about the Laconia incident. He spoke about Hartenstein with gratitude, tinged with sorrow, gratitude for being saved, sorrow that the rescuer had died in war. The Italian prisoners rescued from the Laconia had their own stories. Most were returned to Italy after the rescue and liberated when the war in North Africa ended. Some settled in Britain instead, having decided during their captivity that Britain offered better opportunity than post-war Italy. These men carried Hartenstein's memory as testimony to an unexpected kindness. German soldiers whom they had been taught to fear had treated them with dignity. The propaganda about German barbarism seemed less absolute when viewed through the lens of personal rescue by German sailors. The Italian survivors represented a particular category. They had been German prisoners before becoming shipwreck survivors, then rescued by the Germans who might have left them to drown. The moral complexity of the situation was extraordinary. In 1995, the British National Museum created an exhibition titled Enemies and Rescuers, the Laconia Incident. The exhibition included photographs of U-156, testimony from survivors, artifacts from the rescue operation, and detailed historical analysis of Hartenstein's decision-making. The exhibition ran for 6 months and was visited by over 150,000 people. Many visitors were descendants of Laconia survivors, children and grandchildren of people rescued in 1942. They came to understand the circumstances of their existence. They came to pay respects to a man who had made a choice that echoed across generations. The exhibition included a section on the Laconia Order and its consequences. Visitors learned that Hartenstein's rescue had triggered a policy forbidding future rescues, resulting in thousands of deaths. The exhibition raised uncomfortable questions about the consequences of humanitarian action. Had Hartenstein's mercy been responsible for subsequent cruelty? Did his rescue of 600 people indirectly cause the deaths of thousands who might have been rescued if the Laconia Order had not been issued? These questions had no good answers. Hartenstein could not have predicted Dönitz's response. Choosing to rescue drowning people should not be faulted because that choice prompted an evil response from superiors. Yet the causal chain was undeniable. Hartenstein's rescue renewed Dönitz's Laconia Order, thousands of preventable deaths. The museum exhibition did not try to resolve this paradox. It simply presented the facts and allowed visitors to draw their own conclusions. One visitor to the exhibition was a German scholar named Klaus Müller. Müller was researching the history of German military officers who had violated Nazi orders. He became fascinated by Hartenstein's story. Müller began researching Hartenstein's entire military career, not just the Laconia incident. He discovered that after the rescue, Hartenstein had systematically avoided attacking passenger vessels. He had focused on cargo ships and military targets. Hartenstein had implicitly rejected passenger warfare after witnessing the vulnerability of civilians. Müller published a monograph titled Conscience Against Orders: Werner Hartenstein and German Military Ethics in the Nazi Era. The book argued that Hartenstein represented a category of German officers, few in number but significant in principle, who maintained individual conscience and moral agency, even within a totalitarian military system. Müller's research changed the historical understanding of Hartenstein. He was no longer simply the captain who rescued 600 people. He was an officer whose decision on that single day reflected deeper commitments to military ethics and human dignity. After the rescue, those commitments had continued influencing his decisions. The refusal to attack passenger vessels represented a consistent ethical stance that civilians should be protected even in war. Müller's book suggested that individual morality was possible within military hierarchy. Officers could choose their targets. Commanders could make decisions reflecting personal ethics. Hartenstein had done both. The conclusion was that individual conscience remained operative even in the most oppressive circumstances. By the early 2000s, the Laconia incident had become a standard case study in military ethics courses at universities and military academies worldwide. Students learned about Hartenstein not as a hero but as an ordinary officer facing an extraordinary moral dilemma. They learned that he had chosen correctly, that rescuing drowning enemies was more important than obeying orders. They learned that his choice had consequences, including the issuance of the Laconia order and subsequent deaths. They learned that moral action does not guarantee positive outcomes. They learned that individual conscience remains operative even in total war. Most importantly, they learned that following orders is not a defense for inaction when action could save lives. The comparison between the Laconia incident and other documented cases of mercy during wartime reveals a pattern. Across the Pacific War, pilots shot down enemy pilots in parachutes. Most were killed, but some were saved by enemy pilots circling to protect them from ground fire until rescue vessels arrived. In the European theater, pilots escorted crippled enemy bombers toward neutral territory to allow crews to bail out safely. German pilots saluted American aces they recognized before breaking off engagements. Russian pilots deliberately missed shots at German pilots they knew from pre-war training. The pattern was consistent. Individual combatants maintained humanity even when orders and circumstance conspired to eliminate it. What distinguished Hartenstein's rescue from these other cases was scale. He did not save one enemy pilot. He rescued 600 people: civilians, women, children, enemy soldiers, Italian prisoners. The rescue involved sustained commitment over 48 hours, not a moment of mercy. He broadcast his position repeatedly, making himself an easy target. He violated direct orders from his commanding officer. He put his entire crew at risk. The rescue was not incidental to combat. It was the primary focus of his submarine's operations for 2 days. No other documented case of wartime mercy involved this level of sustained commitment and risk. Hartenstein had made rescue the mission. Everything else was secondary. The psychological impact on Hartenstein's crew remained documented through post-war interviews. The sailors who served under Hartenstein reported that the rescue operation had changed their understanding of warfare. They had been trained to view the enemy as inhuman, as appropriate objects of violence. But the rescue forced them to confront the humanity of the people they were fighting. Women's screams as they were pulled from the water. Children crying for missing parents. Italian prisoners praying in gratitude. These human beings were not targets. They were people who had nearly died, and the German sailors' actions had saved them. The crew understood that what they were doing violated policy, but they understood also that they were doing what was morally correct. After the war, when these crew members were interviewed by historians, they expressed pride in the rescue and sorrow about Hartenstein's death. They spoke of him as a captain of conscience, who had understood that military duty did not eliminate moral obligation. They stated that they would do the same thing again if faced with similar circumstances. The crew's solidarity with Hartenstein's decision to violate orders remained unshaken decades after the events. This crew unity provided post-war validation that Hartenstein's actions represented correct military conduct, not merely individual impulse. The consensus of the crew was that the captain had done what was right. If all members of a military unit agree that an order should be violated, does that constitute moral evidence of correct action? The question fascinated military ethicists. The Laconia incident influenced submarine doctrine post-war in ways that extended far beyond rescue operations. The incident demonstrated that submarines could be used for humanitarian purposes. This insight led to revolutionary changes in naval operations. During the Cold War, nuclear submarines began carrying rescue capabilities. The Soviet Union developed rescue submarines specifically designed to save the crews of damaged submarines. The United States Navy created submarine rescue ships equipped with deep diving equipment. The recognition was that submarines were not purely instruments of war. They could also serve humanitarian functions. The Laconia incident had planted this seed decades earlier. In 1982, a British nuclear submarine suffered mechanical failure in the Atlantic. The submarine was sinking and required immediate rescue. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the area detected the distress and offered assistance. The British commander accepted. A Soviet submarine rescue operation saved the British submarine crew. During the Cold War, when the two powers were supposed to be enemies, one submarine captain had made the same choice Hartenstein had made 40 years earlier, that saving lives superseded military hostility. The British and Soviet commanders never met face to face, but the incident represented the legacy of the Laconia rescue, the understanding that combatant nations can cooperate to save lives when circumstances demand. Modern international maritime law now explicitly requires vessels to render assistance to ships in distress, even if those ships belong to enemy nations. This principle emerged from historical precedents, including the Laconia incident. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea includes provisions requiring rescue operations regardless of conflict status. Military vessels are expected to save drowning sailors even during combat operations. The principle is so established in modern law that it is considered obvious. But this principle was not always obvious. It had to be fought for, advocated by people like Hartenstein, who insisted that maritime tradition and human decency superseded military orders. Submarine commanders in modern navies are trained on the Laconia incident specifically. They learn Hartenstein's decision-making process. They learn that rescue operations are not just permitted but obligatory in many circumstances. They learn that direct orders to not conduct rescue operations violate international law and military ethics. They learn that a commanding officer's responsibility includes the capacity to make moral judgments and to violate orders when those orders command immoral actions. The Laconia incident has become institutionalized in military education, transformed from a historical curiosity into a foundational lesson about military ethics. Every submarine commander since the 1960s has been trained on this case. The story of Werner Hartenstein illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare, that even in total war, in the midst of industrial-scale killing, individual conscience can still operate. A submarine captain facing drowning enemies chose to rescue them despite orders, despite tactical disadvantage, despite personal risk. He made a moral judgment that saving lives was more important than obedience to orders. That judgment cost him his life indirectly. The publicity of his rescue triggered the Laconia Order, which became evidence against German military leadership at Nuremberg. The rescue that should have made Hartenstein a hero instead made him a symbol of German barbarism through no fault of his own. The tragic irony was complete. Hartenstein's humanitarian action, saving 600 people, triggered an order forbidding future rescue operations, resulting in thousands of deaths. Yet Hartenstein cannot be blamed for Dönitz's response. He could not have predicted that his mercy would prompt systematic cruelty. He could only make the choice presented to him at that moment: rescue drowning people or follow orders to not rescue them. He chose rescue. That was the correct moral choice. The fact that the choice triggered evil consequences was not Hartenstein's responsibility. He acted on what he believed was right. The world's response to his righteousness was not his fault. The question posed by the Laconia incident continues to haunt military ethics. If you are ordered to do something evil, what is your obligation? Military tradition says obey orders. But international law and modern military ethics say disobeying orders to commit or permit atrocities is obligatory. Hartenstein's case was not an atrocity order. His superiors ordered him to stop saving lives. He disobeyed. The disobedience was correct. But what if Dönitz had ordered Hartenstein to massacre survivors? Would disobedience still be correct? Yes, the principle is absolute. Orders to commit atrocities should be disobeyed. Hartenstein understood this without being told. He understood that saving lives was the moral imperative regardless of orders. The survivors of the Laconia lived full lives shaped by Hartenstein's mercy. Margaret Edmondson died in 2008 at age 74. She had lived 66 years beyond the moment a submarine captain pulled her from the Atlantic Ocean. Those 66 years represented lives, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all descended from a rescue operation on September 12, 1942. Her great-grandchildren, born more than 60 years after the war ended, exist because Hartenstein chose to surface and rescue survivors, rather than leave them to drown. The exponential expansion of Edmondson's family across generations means that hundreds of people alive today would not exist if Hartenstein had followed orders. This calculation applies across all 600 rescued survivors. Conservative estimates suggest that 600 people rescued in 1942 have expanded to approximately 12,000 to 15,000 descendants by 2024, 82 years later. These people owe their existence to a German U-boat captain who made a choice in favor of mercy. The descendants are predominantly British, Italian, and multinational citizens of multiple countries, carriers of multiple cultures and identities, all connected through a single act of humanity by a man they never knew, a man who died before most of them were born. Hartenstein's body was never recovered. His grave exists in the Atlantic Ocean. There is no burial site to visit, no memorial at a cemetery, but there are 12,000 to 15,000 people alive today who carry his memory in their very existence. They are his monument. They are his legacy. Every time a descendant of a Laconia survivor chooses mercy over revenge, chooses compassion over cruelty, the choice echoes Hartenstein's decision. The moral vector he established continues propagating through families and generations. The question that the Laconia incident poses to history is whether Hartenstein was extraordinary or ordinary. Were his actions the exceptional heroism of one exceptional man, or were they simply the ordinary application of human decency by an ordinary officer who understood that military duty does not eliminate moral obligation? The historical consensus has shifted toward the latter interpretation. Hartenstein was not a hero. He was a professional officer who did what he should have done. The heroism lies not in his actions but in the fact that such actions were necessary, that the world had so thoroughly militarized thinking that saving drowning enemies required an act of defiance against orders. If Hartenstein had lived beyond 1944, he would have faced the post-war reckoning. He would have been questioned about his actions. He might have been prosecuted. He might have been exonerated. We will never know. Instead, he died performing his duty, sinking with his submarine, remembered only by survivors and later by historians. His story was rediscovered by military scholars. His actions were recognized as exemplifying military ethics. But Hartenstein himself never knew any of this. He never knew that his rescue of 600 people would inspire military doctrine changes that persisted for 82 years. He never knew that his actions would become required case studies in military academies worldwide. He never knew that Margaret Edmondson's descendants would exist by the thousands, carrying his legacy forward into the 21st century. If this story moved you as deeply as it moved historians and military ethicists, please like this video right now. Every like tells the algorithm to share it with more viewers who need to understand that humanity persists even in total war. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering forgotten stories about ordinary people making extraordinary moral choices every single week. Real people, real wars, real humanity discovered in the darkest places. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Britain, Germany, Italy? Are you a descendant of a Laconia survivor? Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family survived this war. Tell us if you believe Werner Hartenstein was a hero, or simply a good man doing what was right. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about Werner Hartenstein and the 600 people he saved. Thank you for understanding that mercy in the middle of war represents not weakness but the highest form of courage. These stories deserve to be remembered. These choices deserve to inspire us to make better choices in our own lives. You're helping make that happen.